introduce you today a former foreign minister, a former prime minister, a former president of Chamber of Deputies, and also a person who has a very impressive background as a professor, and not only. Mr. Adrian Nastase. His Excellency accepted to present you a vision. Should I say a vision?
It's too much, but you can say that.
And he's also able to answer to any question you have, and feel free to raise any question either on our subject, Eastern Partnership, or what else would you like to hear from His Excellency. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'll try to introduce a subject which is on the agenda of this autumn. We do not know if there will be a success or a failure. I went through a lot of documents in trying to understand the latest developments on this subject. And what impressed me most was a quotation from a British diplomat who used to say, "Diplomacy is about surviving until next century, while politics is about surviving until Friday afternoon." Well, so I don't really know what will happen in late November in Vilnius in the third summit on Eastern Partnership. It's difficult to have a vision on this subject. It's difficult because, the six members, the six partners, are like in Agatha Christie's novel, disappearing one by one. We do not know how many of them will remain in Vilnius and afterwards. Let me start by saying that, in fact, after the Cold War, Western Europe and the United States, but mainly Western Europe, Western powers in Europe, tried to expand its own influence on eastwards in several stages. The first one was the Visegrad Group. If you remember, at the beginning of 90s, the countries which have been considered for further expansion of the Western Europe were Poland, Czechoslovakia at that time, and Hungary. The second wave was obvious as a target for expansion, political, economic, in the years 2000. And this was a time when practically all countries in Eastern Europe, with the exception of former members of Yugoslavia, became members of the European Union, including Romania. The Eastern Partnership is, in a way, the third wave. and the first step in which Western Europe tried to enter into the space of the former Russian Soviet Empire. Well, it is obvious that in this way, well, a clash took place between the pressure from the West and the reaction from the East, from Russia, which, meanwhile, came back to a kind of global status. Because, as you remember, after the falling apart of Soviet Union, Russia remained at a stage of a regional power, but using in a very smart way the resources that they had, including oil and gas. Russia came back to the original status of global power. Well, now in Vilnius, we'll see how the politics of Western Union to expand eastwards and the reaction of Russia will generate a certain outcome. I don't want to enter into much details. I brought some documents with me. You can find them on internet. There are public documents, most of them. You can find also in Brussels in the EU documents to understand how this process started in 2009. What went wrong, which were the achievements in the first summit in Prague, in the second summit in Warsaw, and what might happen in Vilnius in about 1 month. Well, the European Union, having its own problems, offered a lot of promises to the 6 countries. Russia was more pragmatic. Instead of making promises, just offered some very practical things. Well, we were talking, and we'll discuss later on, about the major objectives of the Eastern Partnership: political association, economic integration, mobility, and sectorial support. These were the major objectives of the partnership. On political association, well, it is a long-term promise, not being very clear if the European Union is ready to accept those countries as members. And after some of the comments made about the latest accession of countries like Romania, Bulgaria, and some others who have been considered as unprepared to become members, it is clear that the European Union is not very keen to accept new members on short term. That's why the accent has been put on free trade, on negotiating and signing For some of those countries, only initialing the treaties of deep and comprehensive free trade areas. It will be with Georgia and Moldova, and as I understood, the signature of the treaty with Ukraine. Only 3 countries being involved in this process. But the focus then will be, and it is put on the economic dimension of the cooperation with those countries, without offering them the political, the political dimension and the political promise that they will become members for the time being. That's why, well, they will enter into a process of association agreements being signed and preparing the reforms and the mechanisms which will in the end eventually lead to membership. Meanwhile, and the other objective, as I mentioned already, was the mobility, the question, in fact, of visas. As you know, the citizens of these countries are very frustrated because they have to go through a very complicated procedure when they want to travel or to go for business on the territory of the European Union. Well, there are promises, there is a roadmap on this issue. In the European Parliament, a roadmap has been presented and has been approved, but it takes a lot of time. Meanwhile, the citizens of this country are free to travel to Moscow. They are free to see their families there. They can get jobs in Russia, and they can do business in Russia. That's why those countries which are in between European Union and Russia are tempted on one side with mainly words, and on the other side with very concrete promises, with very concrete issues. And that's why Armenia, for instance, lately accepted to enter into the Eurasian Union, a project which tries to counterbalance the evolution of the European Union and offering a kind of political and economic magnet to the countries which formerly were part of the Soviet Union. This succeeded, the Russians succeeded with Kazakhstan and Belarus so far. And we are talking about political and economic organization. But it is clear that some other countries might also accept those offers. Armenia, because Azerbaijan, who is a very rich country in resources, doesn't want to become a member of either institutional structure, in a way like Norway. Being rich enough, you don't want to enter into a structure where through regulations or through taxes or fees or whatever, you lose part of your potential wealth. And that's why Azerbaijan, one of the 6 countries from the initial partners for this project, remains calm, remains in a certain standby, not willing to sign neither with the European Union or with Russia. The Russians, well, as you know, there is a very tense conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and Russia offered Azerbaijan a lot of weapons, arms, and in this way, Armenia, which is a smaller country, might be in a very difficult position, having already this border conflict and those tensions that you already know. That's why Armenia considered that it is wiser for its own interest to become a member or to join the Eurasian Union. Let me say a few words about the Eurasian Union. Russia had always a temptation to consider itself as a kind of European power, European. During the centuries, it expanded also towards Asia. Some of the leaders in Moscow consider that a new vision, a new strategy would be necessary. And that's why in the last years, this project, which is not very well studied in our countries, developed in a very dynamic way. Well, some of the roots were obvious from the 90s, but with the CIS, the Community of Independent States, and other initiatives. But in 2011, this project has been launched by President Putin, and it tried to show that Russia is not counting only on Europe as a partner, but is trying to switch, to move much more towards Asia for various reasons, including what was considered also by the Americans as the rise of China as a global power. That's why expanding towards Asia and trying to rebuild that territory, well, was a very clear objective of the leaders in Kremlin. It was important to take on board Kazakhstan with huge resources, agriculture and raw materials, and also they took on board Belarusia, which is the gate through which the communication with Europe was made during centuries of Moscow and Robert Kaplan wrote an article in which he criticized John Kerry for moving the focus from Europe and Asia towards the Middle East. focusing too much on Syria, giving leverage to Russia to enter into the game. And he considered that Europe and Asia are left in a way for more efficient diplomatic action and influence from Russia. At the same time, some of the analysts are emphasizing something which has not an economic, political background, but which might have a clear strategic outcome. The fact that the Americans developed their own reserves of gas. Here, I should focus on something which is different from the European tradition. In our countries, in Europe especially, the owner of the land does not have the ownership of the resources under the land. In the United States, if you own the land, you own also the resources. You remember Dallas and all those fights for oil, and so the owners, especially on big lands, on big surfaces, were interested to develop the exploitation of the raw materials underneath, under the land. Well, it is not the same situation in Romania or other countries, especially in Europe. But in this way, the Americans succeeded to become a net exporter of gas instead of importing gas. The surplus of gas is now directed towards Europe and other countries, and this created a huge problem for the Russians, who used to have as a tool the export of gas towards some of those countries, Ukraine, and also Belarus, and also countries from Eastern Europe in general. Now, because there is a surplus of gas, Germany and some of the countries in the north of Europe can have other ways of getting the natural energy resources. There is a huge battle in the field of energy which the battles have strategic consequences. And Russia has to speed up its policies until political and economic, until some of the results of the new situation in finding the new resources of gas also in Europe, there are some projects of this kind, will not affect the power to influence politics in those countries through the prices of the gas. That's why at this moment, countries like Moldova, like Ukraine, like Belarus are under a certain, I wouldn't say blackmail, but in common words, we might use this formula, but it is a clear pressure not to sign in Vilnius and not to become, not to deepen the relationship with the European Union. It is a clear situation where those countries, especially those in between European Union territorially and Russia, are becoming a kind of a testing ground for acquiring zones of influence. This is mainly, let's say, this is the bet. This is the target for the two sides in Vilnius. We cannot say anything for sure for the time being. You can either have an optimistic view and say, look, the European Union will be wise, will understand that it has to offer very clear, pragmatic things, less bureaucratic, to open the borders, to offer facilities for visas, to offer economic facilities in order to counterbalance some of the custom duties imposed by Russia on the wine from Moldova or some other products from other countries in the partnership. So either the European Union will be wise enough to do things, not to offer words again, or those who are cynical and pessimistic, like Adrian Severin, who wrote a very interesting article on that. Is for the Romanians, refuzul gândirii geostrategice omoară parteneriatul estic al Uniunii Europene. În Politics, în 22 septembrie 1913. It is, well, very cynical, but very pragmatic analysis of the situation with the Eastern Partnership. Well, I don't dare to be as cynical as he was, and being a member of the European Parliament, he knows a lot about those things. At the same time, he was he made reports on Belarus and also on Ukraine. He was in charge with the reports on those countries. He knows well the expectations of those countries. And of course, he's explaining, in a way, the frustrations of those countries who are offered roadmaps, who are offered programs, who are offered promises, while the Russians are very aggressive and very concrete. And this is the real issue in Vilnius, and we'll see if the third summit will change the lines of approaching the partnership. Well, in Prague and Warsaw, in the previous summits, it was a kind of a game trying to see which will be the reactions of Russia when the European Union decided to enter the territory of the former Soviet Union. Well, Russia acted in speeding up the process of creating those institutional structures and offering a lot of benefits, a lot of economic making a lot of economic offers to those countries which are in a way or another put on the map by the European Union. I don't want to take those countries one by one. You know which are which is the situation in Georgia, with the new prime minister, with the president, the situation in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the problem or the question of linking the signing of the treaty with Ukraine of the status, the situation of Yulia Tymoshenko, it's also very strange because it seems that some of the countries in Western Europe do not want Ukraine to come too close to the European Union, but to remain in the Eastern Bloc with Russia. And this might be the temptation that Germany could encourage in order to have a counterbalance and to have a clear assurance about some of the border lines after the Second World War. It's complicated. So this is, the Vilnius meeting will be a new test of the post-war, Cold War temptation to redraft the zones of influence. These are like, this is a kind of replica earthquake coming after 1990, and you have well, a new test about the interests and the capacity of the blocks of power to will meet in Vilnius and well discussing about well the new delimitation lines between West and East. Now, not having only the question of the Conference of Security and Cooperation in Europe from the 70s, from Atlantic to Ural, but discussing about a clear block of forces in Europe and Asia. Well, I don't want to talk too much about this subject. I would rather prefer to have eventually your questions on these subjects or others connected to what I have tried to explain. And well, if I will be able to respond, I will do that.
Thank you for your
Introduce yourself.
Yes. My name is Nicolae Titulescu. I come from the Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I was wondering, considering how you touched upon the subject of Russia and how Russia seems to adhere to very strict principles as compared to the European Union. I was wondering if the Vilnius summit will be such a well-expected success. How would you see the future Russian reactions? We talked about in the first days about small intimidating steps that Moscow seems to be doing. But I was wondering, what is your evaluation of